Hello everyone, welcome to technical section of Azerbaijan State Oil Industry University SPE student chapter in collaboration with Pi Petro. Thank you Dr. Ahmed Al-Kahi for organizing it, and thank you Engineer Yusuf Al-Waziri for accepting our invitation, and thank you all for joining. My name is Suyan Farazli. I'm a chapter president of SPE SAU, and I will be your moderator today. The topic of the session will be hydraulic fracturing operations and led by Engineer Yusuf Al-Waziri. Yusuf Al-Waziri is a drilling and completion field engineer for Technip FMC in West Texas. He also worked as a frac engineer in the Permian Basin. He graduated from Texas Tech with a bachelor's and master's degree in petroleum engineering. His research is focused on hydraulic fracturing and DFIT analysis. If you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to ask questions in question and A section. We will have time for questions at the end. And Engineer Yusuf Al-Waziri, please continue. The session is over to you.
Thank you very much, Hussein. I'd like to thank BioPetro and SPE's chapter of ASOIU. Welcome to the technical session on frac and equipment operation. Like Hussein said, we'll be taking questions at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A section. So the agenda for today will be an introduction about fracking. Then we'll look at frac location and what the frac equipment are. Then we'll discuss wellhead and wireline. So what is fracturing? Fracturing is a well stimulation technique. It's usually used in low permeability formations, but it does not mean that it's not used in high permeability formation. It also used in high permeability formation for several reasons. But first, fracking, just to explain it in quick words, it's the process of injecting a pressurized fluid or a fracturing fluid, which might have different composition, to create fractures in the formation. This fracturing fluid consists of water, chemicals, and sand. Sand is pumped just to keep the fracture open and to create the required conductivity. And again, just to mention this, the purpose of fracturing is not to increase the permeability of the formation, but to create conductivity and increase conductivity. Conductivity is a function of the fracture permeability and the width of the fracture. So this is what a frac location looks like. This is a typical example of a frac location, but that's not the only frac location site you might see. We might be seeing fluid storage, proppant storage, blender. These are the pumps, and this is the wellhead where everything is pumped inside of the wellhead. We will discuss in this session basically the different components of this frac location and just to understand how fracking is being done. So I'm just taking here some different pictures of a frac location. As I said, you might see different layouts. What connects all the frac equipment is iron. Iron is as you can see, I'm talking about these pieces of iron or joints and swivels that help us change directions. And this is basically high pressure iron where the fluid will be moving. The fluid is pressurized at a high pressure, so it might not be transferred in regular hoses or low pressure iron. A specific iron has to be used that can maintain this very high pressure. Depending on the pressure, you might see 1002 iron or 1502 iron. 1002 iron is for 10K and for 10,000 psi. 1502 is for 15,000 psi. Usually the pressure rating is usually on the wing of the valve. So this is a wing. This is what we call a wing. It's on the wing of the iron. And every piece of iron has a maximum flow rate that can flow through it. The barrel per minute is 2 times the ID squared, the inner ID squared. This iron is regularly tested, 3 to 4 months. Some company do it more often, some company do it less often. And there's a band, you see this band basically tells you when was the last time the iron was tested and when it's supposed to be tested next. And here are the swivel joints. The swivel joint are these. It's called swivel or Chickson, and they're used to change the direction of the flow. Another part of the iron layout that we're talking about is the missile, and that is what I mean by the missile. Missile is basically where all the pumps pump their fluids. They get mixed in the missile, and it's just used to rig up the location easier and rig down quicker. Rig up means basically come to the location and put everything together. Rig down is dismantle everything and get ready to leave location. Also on the missile, we see this densiometer. This densiometer basically gives us the density of our fluid. So for example, if we pump acid, we'll see that the density is going to go up. If we use more sand, the density is going to go up, and so on. There's also another densiometer by the blender, but we'll get to that later. Another part of the iron are the valves, the ground valves and wheel valve. So this is an example of a ground valve and wheel valve. It's usually between the missile and the wellhead, and it's used to separate the equipment from the wellhead. So if you shut in these valves just by turning these handles clockwise, any flow coming from the well is not going to go to the equipment. And a check valve is a valve that prevents flow to go into one direction and one direction only. So if you look, this is an example of a check valve. Also, this is an example of a check valve. If you look here, there's an arrow on the check valve, meaning that fluid is only going to go from here, from the left side to the hand side. If there's backflow or fluid is trying to go from the right side to the left side, the valve is not going to allow it. There's a flapper usually, and the flapper goes down, blocking the way. If the fluid is in the direction of the flow, the flapper goes up, allowing the fluid to pass through. There's also bleed off for low torque valves, which are these small valves, and they're used to bleed off the pressure. So let's say we have a lot of pressure and we want to decrease the pressure to 0. You just open these low torque valves and the pressure goes and gets released somewhere, usually somewhere controlled. And finally, we have the pop-off and burst disc. These are pressure relief valves that are set to a specific pressure, right? In case there's a case of overpressuring and pressure goes up unexpectedly, then these two valves are going to pop off and they're going to release the pressure just to not hurt our equipment or create a problem. I'm just showing you guys some more pictures of the iron layout. Here we have pop-off. Another way of connecting equipment together is hoses, but hoses is usually for lower pressures. So hoses come in different lengths, 10, 15, or 20 feet. Every hose can withstand up to between 8 to 10 barrels per minute. There's suction hoses that are rated for 150 psi, and they're wired from the inside to prevent collapse because you use them for suction. On the other side, we'll see discharge hoses. They're rated for 400 psi, and they're designed to prevent burst. We also use acid hoses, and usually they're in a different color. For example, here they're green, just for us to identify them, to know which one is for acid and which one is not for acid. And again, they're coated from the inside because acid may eat out the rubber. Usually the suction and discharge hoses, suction would be on the suction side of the blender, discharge is going to be on the discharge side of the blender. Now that we talked about what connects everything together, which are these lines, right? Now we'll talk about every single component of a frac location. So we'll start here with the fluid storage. Fluid storage is just where we keep our fluids. The fluids is usually water, and water is the most important component of fracturing fluid. So these tanks have to be full of water all the time because we use the water for fracking, right? But there's also, you might also see some other containers where it says acid and acid. That's also to store our acid on location, which is also a fluid. Now, the chemical trucks, we'll go to the chemicals. This is the chemical truck, or the C10. It's called C10 because it has 10 pumps for 10 different chemicals. It also holds 10 totes. So a tote, I'll show you a picture later, but it's a container that can contain around 330 gallons of fluid. So as I said, it has 10 liquid additive pumps, and there's different types of pumps that we'll talk about here. So there might be a triplex plunger, progressive cavity pump, and a Waukesha pump. Every pump is used for a specific chemical. So for example, if I want to use a very viscous fluid or a very viscous chemical, I'll be using the progressive cavity pump. If on the other hand, I'm using another chemical that has a lot of particles, it would be, I would use the Waukesha pump. So this is what I was talking about, the different totes. Every tote can contain up to 330 gallons approximately. We can see that this tote has some guardrails. That's just to prevent the tote from expanding due to the weather or the chemical reaction. Here we can see that this is a tote that basically is not as transparent as these totes, and that's because it's probably we would put inside of this tote chemicals that can react with the sun or with heat. So we put them in these specific totes just to avoid any chemical reaction. This is an ISO, and an ISO is basically a huge container that can withstand up to 5,000 gallons, and we use it with the chemicals that we use often. Usually it's the FR, friction reducer. A friction reducer is used a lot for every single frac stage, so we use a lot of it on location. So instead of getting small totes and keep swapping them and stuff, we just get this big ISO and store the FR on location. Now that we talked about the fluid storage, we'll go to the proppant storage. Proppant is the sand. There's different sand types, there's different sand sizes. Sand is used pretty much in every single frac stage in huge numbers, probably around from 300,000 to 600,000 or 700,000 pounds of sand per stage. So you may have to make sure that sand is on location and is stored. So there's different ways of storing sand on location. I'm just going to discuss a couple. There's sand kings, which have, as you can see here, different compartments, and they have levers to bring the sand king up and down, basically just to drain the sand with gravity. And it's manually strapped, so you would have to put a strap, and based on the number of inches inside of the container, you'll know how many pounds of sand you have inside. Another way is the silos. As you can see here, the silos are these long, wide, basically vertical compartments. Usually there's 6 of them on location, but again, it might change. You can have less number or a higher number. From the bottom, they have a gate, And whenever this gate opens, with gravity, sand depletes. But they have sensors that reads where the sand is inside of the silo. So you know percentage. It gives you percentages. For example, it's 50% full, 48% full, and so on. Sand is transported to the silos, usually through trucks. And this is an example of a sand truck. So the sand truck backs up, and then through this hose and through a differential pressure of around 10 to 14 psi, sand would come out of the sand truck and then go up all the way on the silo and then gets dumped from the top. And then that's how we keep filling these silos up with these sand trucks. The conveyor belt is, so if you can imagine it, these are the 6 silos, and this hose is for every silo, and all the sand gets accumulated on the conveyor belt. And then the conveyor belt is just like the conveyor belt that you walk on at the malls or at the airport, where you stand and it slides you. That's the same concept. Sand gets on the conveyor belt, gets slided, and gets dumped into the hopper of the blender, and we'll talk about this later. But this is how the sand is basically transported to where it's supposed to be. Now let's talk a little bit about the sand. Usually the operator in their frac design, they design which type of sand they want to use, and that's basically based on the fracture that they want to create, the fracture, the conductivity they want to create, and so on. So there's different types and sizes for the sand. And there's also natural made sand and man-made sand. So the man-made sand, for example, like the ceramic here, has the highest conductivity because it's man-made, so it's more uniform. The natural sand gives you a lower conductivity just because it has irregular size and shape because it's natural. And the factors that affect us choosing or selecting our proppant is the size, shape, strength, because it gets crushed, and the conductivity that we want to create. So now that we talked about the chemicals, the fluid storage, and the proppant, all of these 3, the sand, the water, and the chemicals, get all mixed in the blender. So the blender is the heartbeat of the treatment. That's where, what I said, it collects the water, chemicals, and proppant. If we look at the blender, the fluid gets collected from the suction side, or the suction valves of the blender. So the blender has a suction side and a discharge side. The suction side is going to be sucking the water, right? The chemicals get dumped inside of the hopper here. And same thing with the sand and the chemicals, both of them get dumped, the sand gets dumped into the hopper, but the chemicals get dumped here in the tub. And then the sand is transported from the hopper. It goes up using augers like elevator, and then gets dumped into the tub. That's what the tub looks like. Everything gets mixed in the tub. You see these green lines? These are basically chemical lines. And from the top left here, you can see this is where the sand is coming, and it's all blended here into the tub. I mentioned earlier that there's a densometer on the missile that gives you the density. There's also a densometer on the blender that gives you the density of basically the mix that we're preparing here in the tub. There's a densometer, I'll show you this picture. Here it is. That's also going to read the density of the mixture that we're preparing. These are also chemical pumps that are on the blender. And this is the auger that I was telling you about that basically lifts the sand up to the tub. Now that we have our mixture ready in the blender, our fracturing mixture or the fracturing fluid in the blender, we need to pressurize, because that's the whole point of fracking, is to pump at a high pressure. So that's where we get to the pumps. Based on the pressure that we want to create, the rate that we want to get in the horsepower, we have a specific number of pumps on location. Again, it's based on the pressure and based on the rate. So you might have 12 pumps, you might have 16 pumps, more or less. Every pump has a power end, which is basically 100% mechanical with gears and orbital gears and planetary gears. This is what creates the force for the plunger to pressurize the fluid in the fluid end. So the fluid end is where the water goes in, or the fracturing fluid goes in, gets pressurized with the plungers, with seats and valves, and I'll show you pictures of all of that. And then it gets discharged here at a high pressure and rate. So, as I said, the horsepower is a function of the pressure and the rate, and there's a direct relationship. Hydraulic horsepower is equal to pressure times rate divided by 40.8, and that's how you know how many pumps you need on location. These are examples of seats and valves that are in the fluid end. This is an example of a plunger, and this is an example of a transducer. Transducer is on top of the pump here. As you see here, is on top of the fluid end, and it just treats the pressure that we have. So all these pumps are controlled in the data van, and I'll show you guys what a data van looks like in a little bit. All these pumps are controlled by computer in the data van. So this is a pump operator, and in front of him are screens. Every line, if you see every horizontal line, is a pump, and it's just like a car. You put it in first gear, second gear, third gear. You control the RPM. You can monitor the pressure, the temperature, the RPMs, transmission pressure, everything from this computer. And also, the pumps are protected by kickouts. So remember, we said that there's a transducer on top of the fluid end. This transducer is set at a specific pressure. If for some reason we exceed this specific pressure, then the pump stops by itself, and that's just to protect the equipment. We said that this data van operator, that the pump operator is sitting in the data van. So I'm just giving you a feel. Every data van looks different, but this is just an example of one data van. You'd have here the engineer sitting in the corner. This is where the treater or the supervisor sits. And this is where the company man or the representative of the operator sits, and everything is monitored with these screens so that we can make a decision on the fly. If you remember, I talked earlier also about the silos and how there's a percentage for the silo to know how much it's full or not full. This is the box, or basically the screen that tells you silo 1 has X%, silo 2 has X%, and so on. Now, moving to the wellhead, this is what a wellhead looks like. So here we have basically 4 wellheads next to each other. 1, 2, 3, 4. Everything gets pumped inside of the wellhead, but the wellhead is just there to for well control. So just to make sure that you're not having any kick or anything coming from the outside, this is how you control your well. Usually there's a lower master valve that is usually manual. So you see it has a hand wheel here that you turn to open and close. There's another upper master valve that is hydraulic. And by hydraulic, it means that it's operated through hydraulic lines from outside of the red zone. So you might be outside like 100 feet away from the well, and you have a handle. You turn it to the right to close, or to the left to open it. And then this is another crown valve, or this is usually for wireline. and then you have wing valves. Wing valves, one side is usually for pump down. Pump down, we'll talk about this later, is what we use to pump down the wireline guns. So whenever the gun gets lowered, the wireline guns get lowered in a horizontal well, pump down is basically what pushes it to where it's supposed to be. And flowback. Flowback is basically if we need to flow back the well, then fluid is going to be coming here and then going to the flowback wings. This is another layout where also you see here your 3 wells, red, white, and blue. And then these would be zipper manifolds. Zipper manifolds are used to control the flow. So let's say if we want to pump in this blue well, we would close the zipper valves, the white zipper valves that are here and the red zipper valves that are here, and the flow is only going to be going to the blue valve, and vice versa. If we want to only frag the white valve, the white well, we would close these zipper valves here and the zipper valves here. Now with technology, we're trying to get away of using iron that we talked about, and this is actually, it's called the well flex, which is a hose, but it's not a hose, it's not a suction or discharge hose that we talked about. This is a hose that can withstand up to 15,000 psi. So this is just something new, something cool that I wanted to show you guys. This is what a valve looks like. This in the middle is a gate, and the gate has a hole in the middle. So the way this works is that the valve has this metal gate and it slides left and right. So if this hole aligns with the well, it means that the well is open. But then if you slide it, then the hole for the well is only going to be touching this, so it's going to be sealing, and the well is going to be closed. The black stuff is basically grease, because we need grease to basically make sure that the gate is gonna slide smoothly to open and close. Now that we talked about the wellhead, let's talk about wireline. So the whole point of wireline is to basically create perforations so that the fracturing fluid can go inside of the perforation. Usually you will not see a frac location without a wireline crew. So the way wireline works is you have these wireline guns, they get lowered, right, all the way into the horizontal well. You set your plug to isolate the previous zone that you already perforated. So let's say this zone was already perforated, right? We're going to slide our guns. We're going to use pump down to push the guns to get all the way here. As soon as we get here, we're going to set this plug, right? And the plug is just, again, to isolate this zone. And after setting the plug, you slide back a little bit, and then you shoot your guns to create these perforations, right? And right after we created these perforations, frac is going to come and it's going to pump all the fluid that needs to be pumped. The fluid is going to go into the perforations. It's going to create fractures. Sand is going to stay there, and then that's it. And then whenever the frac stage is done, wireline is going to come again, right? Set another plug over here, and then create these perforations, and so far and so forth. Whenever these are created, another plug is going to be set here, and perfs are going to be created here, and so on. So this is an example. So this is a wireline truck. This is an example of what a wireline truck looks like. This is the wireline string, as you can see it. These silver dots are basically the shots, or this whole thing is the gun, and these are the shots that are shot to create perforations. And at the end of the string, which is here, is the plug. And I'm zooming in to show you what a plugs looks like. It's just used for isolation. And that's all I have for you guys for today regarding the frac operations. We'll be starting the questions whenever you guys are ready.
Thank you for presentation, and we have several questions here. First question is, why do we need sand to maintain the fracture? Why the fracture just doesn't stay as sand closes?
Sorry, can you repeat the second part of the question? I couldn't hear you.
Yes, why the fracture just doesn't stay as it is and closes?
So it's a good question. The fracture, so if we create a fracture, right, and then we stop pumping, just due to gravity and due to the weight of the rocks, the fracture is going to close again. Pumping fluid is going to open it. As soon as you stop pumping, it's going to close again. And that's why we use sand or small grains of sand, because you pump the fluid with sand, right? And then you stop pumping, the fracture closes, then there's going to be small grains of sand that are going to keep the fracture open, allowing to create conductivity. And that's why we say there's different types of sand. If I get a big sand, so it's going to be a big grain, the fracture is going to be that open. Smaller sand are going to create smaller fractures or lower conductivity. And that's where selecting the correct sand type or size comes in.
The next question is, how these walls control pressure? Is there any sensor on walls?
How does what control pressure?
Walls control pressure. Valves.
Oh, the valves control. Okay, how does the valve control pressure? Perfect, good question. So by control, I mean, okay, let me go back. Okay, by pressure control, I mean, what if we have a kick? What if we have unexpected amount of pressure coming from the reservoir going up, right? If I don't have any valves, the fluid is gonna come up, right? It's gonna come up like you saw in the movies, and oil is gonna be coming out and stuff. So the valves are basically there to stop the flow. So if you have anything coming out, right, and then you have this gate, this huge metal gate blocking it, then you're not going to have anything that's going to come out. And that's why we have several layers. So we have a valve here and a valve here, so that in case this valve leaks or it's not working correctly, you don't want to have 10,000 psi coming out into the sky uncontrolled. So that's why we have a second valve as a backup. And that's how valves control pressure.
The third question, what amount of differential pressure is needed exactly to pump sand way up to the top of silos?
So there's no exact number. The higher, so it depends on the silo. Some silos can do up to 15, some silos can do up to 10. So there's no exact number. I would say that obviously the higher the pressure differential is, the quicker you're going to be offloading sand from the truck to the silo. But there is no exact number. Most of the silos are going to have a pressure differential between 10 and 14.
The first question is, what's resin-coated sand?
Okay, good question. So resin-coated sand is a type of sand. So let's go to the slide. Oh, I think. So resin-coated sand is a type of sand that is I can't say it's not natural sand. It's man-made, and it has irregular size and shape, and it's used to create medium conductivity. So basically, it's sand that is coated with some kind of material just to have a higher crush. It can withstand a higher crush pressure. So it's basically a stronger sand. It's a stronger type of sand.
The next question is the fluid for hydraulic fracturing usually heated?
Is the what? Sorry.
Is the fluid for hydraulic fracturing usually heated?
No, it's not. It's not heated. No.
Okay. The next question, do they use only WL tools to set up plugs and perforate the pay zone, or this operation can be done by other service segments?
So it's a good question. Usually it's so the wireline that we are talking about here is just for plug and perf. Trying to get, yeah. So it's used usually for plug and perf. This is usually done before frac gets there. So this service is done previously before frac locations, but with that being said, sometimes logging is done on the first frac stage. So whenever the wireline goes in for the first stage, whenever they set their first plug, on their way out, they'd be having logging tools connected to their drill string, and they would log on the way out, just basically to match the driller's depth with the logger's depth and so on. But logging for formation is usually done at another level.
And the last question is, how is the direction of the fracture propagation controlled?
So that's the direction of the good question. The fracture of the fracture propagation is not something that is controlled during frac operation. This is something that comes during the design of the fracturing job and also during the drilling, because I don't want to get into stresses and stuff. Some other people can talk about it. Whenever we come to fracturing, you do not control the fracture propagation, no.
If you don't mind, I can share some answer for this question, if you don't mind.
Please.
Okay, so the standard, we drill all horizontal wells parallel to minimum horizontal stress. Okay, because we know by default the hydraulic fracture will be perpendicular to the least stress, which is most likely the minimum. So this is why we call the maximum, the hydraulic fracture grow with the maximum horizontal stress, and the horizontal well drilled with the minimum horizontal stress. This is why they will be perpendicular with each other, and this will get the maximum contact area between the well and the reservoir. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you, doctor. But yeah, you don't control it during fracturing operations.
And that's the end of the session. And thank you all for joining. Thank you, Engineer Yusuf Al-Waziri, for accepting our invitation, and Dr. Ahmed Al-Karhi for organizing this
Thank you so much.
session.
Appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Bye.